I sometimes wondered to myself, how often do people see the abandoned yellow dome in Epcot, and themselves wonder what it is or what it used to be? If you're watching this, then chances are that you know exactly what it is as the former Wonders of Life Pavilion, which was a massive expansion that opened in 1989 and had many attractions that all focused on health and the human body. When I think of Epcot, I think of the park as existing in three distinct eras. There is the initial classic Epcot, filled with educational rides and shows, and very much designed as a permanent World's Fair, being specifically inspired by the Futurama exhibit at the 1939 fair in New York. The second era of Epcot was the postmodern era, pivoting towards thrill rides like Test Track and Mission Space, and adopting a very specific 90s aesthetic and tone throughout its buildings and rides that felt very much like stepping into an episode of Bill Nye the Science Guy. It was an era for the park where many strange decisions were made, but at least the focus was still on impressing park guests through science and education, but just made to be more fun, or at least that was the idea. Finally though, the most recent era, which came to be through the slow rollout of the Epcot overhaul in the early 2020s, is really just a whole lot of nothing. The core of Epcot has been transformed into a tasteless corporate park, the buildings have become sterile, uninspired places to be, and this new Epcot works as a generic template for IP-based rides that are not about guest enjoyment, but rather about brand synergy and superficially advertising Disney characters to people. That's not what this video is about, although I can't miss an opportunity to take a dig at the new awful version of the core, but the point is that I view the park within the framework of these three eras. The Wonders of Life doesn't really fit any era though, because while people often lump it in with what I consider to be classic Epcot and its additional pavilions like Horizons or the Living Seas, to me, it doesn't really seem to fit there at all. I think the postmodern era is more appropriate, and indeed, its interior is very much a postmodern design. If you watched my video on theme parks in the 90s, then you might recall how I talked about the Memphis aesthetic, a colorful, nonsensical design from the 80s that went on to inspire the postmodern maximalism in restaurants, retail, and especially theme parks throughout the 90s and early aughts. It's clear that the Wonders of Life was a pavilion based specifically on Memphis design to an extreme degree, and so because it's so specific, it feels very out of place with Epcot's classic World's Fair, but also with the dark and cozy science museum aesthetic of the postmodern era. Further, what makes the Wonders of Life so strange is that from its conception as an original pavilion that would have opened with the park in 1982, it was always designed with a circus theme to tie different elements of the body and health together. Not only was this an incredibly strange idea on its own, but by the time it was built a decade later, to mix the circus theme in with such a very specific Memphis inspiration, well, the result was something not very pretty, but certainly very unique. While a lot of people are interested in the legacy of this pavilion, I don't think it's because it was necessarily good, whether aesthetically or in terms of the attractions that it offered. Rather, it has gained a reputation as the long-forgotten Epcot pavilion that was unpopular and often a ghost town, and once it closed on the 1st of January in 2007, it became legendary as a mysterious building that was the target of urban explorers. People have already extensively covered the history of the pavilion or talked about its abandoned state, so today I wanted to approach it from a new and different angle. The Wonders of Life is Epcot's weirdest pavilion, one which stood out because it never really fit the park, had some of the strangest and most uncomfortable Disney attractions to ever exist, and because it was based around very 1980s ideas about health and the body. I have to ask, if it were still open today, would this pavilion have stood the test of time? Aesthetically, Communicore, which was the center of Epcot's future world, was very heavily based on the futurism of the 1939 New York World's Fair. However, as you moved out into the surrounding pavilions, they certainly borrowed from that design, but also incorporated more modern elements of the 1970s. Many of these buildings were a bit sterile, though not without color, but with the introduction of the Wonders of Life, the artistic direction of the park was suddenly disrupted by this bright yellow dome. The original archway sign was removed within a few years and actually made its way to the Magic Kingdom parking entrance structure, but its replacement was about the most Memphis-inspired signage I've ever seen. Walking inside among the teal, pastel purple, and yellow, the aesthetic choice incorporated into the circus theme resulted in one of the most garish Disney creations to ever exist. That's not to say that I dislike it though. In fact, its pure ugliness is what makes it interesting and unique, and in retrospect, is a huge part of its charm. From a concept model from the late 70s, the original pavilion was designed to have you enter a central circle labeled as the Great Midway of Life, where from here, you entered through the tent and funhouse facades to experience various shows or interactive attractions. The actual pavilion that was built a decade later was conceptually very much the same, although in my opinion, the circus theme really should have been dropped for something more relevant. In the center of the dome, 3 theater shows could be experienced by guests, with the least interesting having been known as anatomical players, featuring live cast members who acted out comedic skits that related to the body and health. There seemed to be a few variations of the acts, but in my opinion, the show was actually pretty lame.
The anatomical players also teach lessons. Here, a red corpuscle is fighting off disease.
Hang on! It seems that Ken has not taken a vacation in 9 years!
That means his immune system is history, and so are you!
Moving clockwise, the next show was known as Goofy About Health, which was another small theater where guests looked out onto a Cartoon City facade. Inside the windows of the shops and apartments, televisions were placed to depict the show, and once started, it was structured like an actual Goofy short, where an oblivious narrator introduces him as the champion of healthy living.
Yes, the king is returning to his castle, triumphant after a day of battle.
Shortly, the audience learns that Goofy's daily routine involves stressful situations, wolfing down unhealthy foods for dinner, chain smoking, and retreating to the bar every night. At the start of the next day, Goofy continues his healthy habits by immediately waking up to a cigarette, struggles to get some pills down to wake him up, and then engages in reckless driving on his way to his job where he is overworked. On his lunch break, Goofy sneaks off to the bar for an afternoon drink, and after being told to leave work early for his poor performance, returns to the bar and drives home while intoxicated. The narrator notices that Goofy appears sick, and getting diagnosed by the doctor, Goofy is told that he needs to make changes to his unhealthy lifestyle. After a blues song about how all of Goofy's unhealthy lifestyle choices are destroying his body, he makes changes by quitting smoking, eating healthier, smaller quantities of food, and getting a good night's rest, which leads to major improvements in his overall experience through life and work. I feel the show illustrates how unhealthy habits compound stress and lead to even worse lifestyle habits pretty well, and I do enjoy how the narrator essentially turns this into an elaborately styled Goofy short, but ultimately, the show is pretty forgettable. I was also quite surprised to see just how heavily Goofy is smoking and drinking, because a depiction like that would be unheard of today, although it does make sense, as these were certainly larger issues 35 years ago. Speaking of material that feels strange for a Disney park, the last of these trio of shows was in another small venue known as the Birth Theater, and the film that played was titled The Making of Me. Hosted by Martin Short, the show follows his character as he vaguely speaks about how biological reproduction works, which is attempting to be tasteful as he chronicles how his parents met and created him, but it ends up being more awkward than I think it was intended. I mean, can you imagine all of the uncomfortable squirming from people and kids sitting down in a closed theater and watching this with their parents? At a blue sky level, I understand why you would want to discuss reproduction in a body and health pavilion, but in actual practice, this might be one of the most ill-conceived attractions ever produced. I won't discuss any details because I'm wary of the video being flagged as inappropriate, but if you're curious about just how strange it is, I recommend going and watching a video of the full show. Moving on to the outer circle of the pavilion, there was a quick service counter known as Pure and Simple, which focused on fat-free foods, certainly a trend of the 80s. In the tradition of interactive exhibits around Epcot and its pavilions, the Wonders of Life also featured an area known as the Sensory Funhouse. Here, you could move around to different themed stations that stimulated the senses, such as an exhibit that taught you how to read Braille, video screens that showed pixelated photos where you had to guess what the picture was, and various optical, auditory, and other sensory illusions. There was even a faux house interior where you could participate in the illusion of becoming larger and taller than another person by standing on the other side of the room. Overall, this area wasn't that interesting or informative. It was more a series of interactive stations that seemed somewhat entertaining for kids. Another memorable exhibit along the perimeter was the Wonder Cycles, which allowed you to simulate pedaling a bike through 3 different locations, including Disneyland Park. This was reportedly relatively popular, and was marketed as the future of exercise. So yeah, I've seen these in a gym before, so I suppose that's true. Another interesting exhibit was known as Coach's Corner, which allowed you to step into a styled cage where you could hit a baseball, swing a golf club, or hit a tennis ball. What made this novel was that after sensors detected where the ball went, a pre-recorded video of an athlete from their respective sport would provide pointers for your technique and form. Next to Coach's Corner was also a store, Well & Goods Limited, which sold sports jerseys and equipment with a Disney flair. When originally conceiving the idea for this video, I initially wanted to approach the Wonders of Life and ask how the information presented in the pavilion holds up today. Considering that it's a product of the 80s, I wondered if a lot of information would be something that we reject 35 years later, but to my surprise, there was actually a lot less depth in the exhibits than I thought. So, as far as I can determine, the information seems like straightforward, simple science, or was otherwise emphasizing exercise, which I think we can all agree is generally good for the body. The pavilion is actually a lot more surface level than I anticipated, which only further alienates it from the other Epcot pavilions with interesting exhibits that came before. I next want to briefly pivot to something that I've never seen anyone else talk about, but in terms of educational material, The Wonders of Life was sponsored by MetLife, and in conjunction with Disney, 3 small short films were produced that were sent out to schools to promote the pavilion. The shorts all related to learning about the different organs of the body, which were portrayed through animated segments, and as a plot played out with live actors, the educational material was peppered throughout. In the first film, Bones and Muscles, a kid named Alex is sitting with his friends on the stairs at their first middle school dance. Alex complains about not knowing how to dance, as his friends try to encourage him to attempt to do so, and catching the eye of his crush Lisa, the rest of the film runs through a plot where he gains a bit of courage. The educational material here relates to how the bones and muscles work together here to allow you to dance, which is all factual, but not very interesting. In the second film, The Brain and the Nervous System, a classroom full of kids learn about the function of the brain as a bully named Sylvester is embarrassed by his classmates for his lack of knowledge of how it all works. In the third film, titled The Heart and the Lungs Play Ball, 2 kids from the previous short, Fred and Jessica, go to baseball tryouts. On arrival, Jessica loses confidence because she's the only girl trying out for the team. Fred tries to encourage her, but Sylvester returns, mocking her as a misogynistic bully, and the film proceeds to teach about the lungs and heart as she triumphs and makes the team. These shorts came off as weirdly nostalgic to me, despite not having ever seen them prior to researching this video, but what makes them nostalgic is that they remind me of an era of Disney where education felt important, even if the information was pretty surface level. While these films are just kind of okay, I also felt that they're an interesting part of the history of the Wonders of Life that seemed to go unmentioned, and so I thought that it would be interesting to briefly cover them. Something else notable about the shorts is that each one starts with an animated segment that introduces Captain Cortex, who resides at Cranium Command. Captain Cortex is a character that was part of the pavilion's early history but was cut, and when the pavilion actually opened, it had its own version of Cranium Command that existed with a different main character. Cranium Command was conceptualized as an educational but high-energy show, and entering the queue, park guests then lined up for a pre-show that introduces a military drill sergeant known as General Knowledge. The pre-show begins as he prepares his crack squad of what are called Cranium Commandos for Cranium Command a station that requires an efficient exchange of information between the brain and the body to navigate the challenges of life. After some entertaining dialogue, General Knowledge calls up a nervous recruit named Buzzy, who serves as the main character of the attraction, having been developed as a replacement for Captain Cortex. After berating Buzzy, which works as exposition for how the brain is controlled through a command center, General Knowledge orders the other commandos to man their stations, and they're placed into the heads of their respective assignments, which visually is a bit of a creepy scene. Among ordering commandos into the heads of a rocket scientist and an NFL running back, General Knowledge is concerned to learn that Buzzy has been assigned the hardest vessel of all, a 12-year-old boy getting ready for his day at school. As the heads are dispatched and screwed onto the bodies, General Knowledge turns to the audience, berating them for standing around, which results in the theater doors opening and the park guests walking into the theater. On starting, an animatronic Buzzy attempts to turn on the lights, but also activates a transmission from General Knowledge, who instructs him to pilot the boy, whose name is Bobby, and doing all of this without overstressing the craft. Once Buzzy is in control, he calls for the left and right brain, but accidentally summons the hypothalamus, an industrial animatronic figure which rises out of the stage and provides comedic exposition about how he monitors all of the body's automatic functions. On pointing out that the body is in sleep mode, he retreats, and the theater is filled with heavy metal as Bobby is woken up by his alarm clock, causing Buzzy to be startled into panic. As the boy's room is viewed through the eyes, Buzzy meets the formal and structured left brain, which is followed by the zany and creative right brain. Next, Buzzy checks in with the heart, which is operated by two avatars in muscle suits who parody Arnold Schwarzenegger. He then meets the chaotic adrenaline gland and the blue-collar stomach before Bobby is called by his mother, who hurries him to make the bus. Buzzy then tries to pilot him to the door before the left brain points out that he's not yet dressed, and having done so, passes the bathroom to the protest of the elimination department. Running downstairs to the door, the stomach guides Buzzy to the table for a quick breakfast, and the adrenaline glands kick in as the bus is seen leaving, causing Bobby to run and avoid obstacles as he sprints through the neighborhood and a neighboring house to reach school on time. Making it just in time for chemistry class, Bobby sits down next to a new classmate named Annie, and as he notices that he finds her to be pretty, the heart chimes in to say that they've just skipped a beat. After Buzzy fumbles the awkward interaction, and Bobby is distracted by Annie, he accidentally causes a gaseous reaction by not paying attention to what he's doing in class, which manifests in the theater through a smoke effect. After being lectured by the other parts of the body, Bobby is piloted to lunch to the satisfaction of the stomach. Meeting Annie again, Bobby is pleased to see her, but their interaction is interrupted by bullies who wreck her lunch. Interrupting them, they retaliate by stuffing Bobby headfirst into a trash can, but analyzing his battle options, he retaliates by throwing discarded lunch in their face, resulting in a cafeteria-wide food fight. The hypothalamus reappears to activate pain suppressors, and as the food fight continues, it's framed as a military operation to fit the theme of the attraction. Getting hit with food in the face from the bullies, the theater goes dark as General Knowledge reappears to berate Buzzy for listening to all the other organs, but not taking control himself in the brain where he's in charge. On regaining control, Bobby is now aware of being brought to the office, and sitting down in front of the principal, the various organs, from the hyperventilating lungs, to the cynical defeatism of the left brain, to the rapid beat of the heart, all check in as Bobby stalls to figure out what to say to avoid getting in trouble. General Knowledge reappears to lecture Buzzy about how to get the stress under control, and demanding that Buzzy be calm, cool, collected, and take charge, he manages to calm the rest of the body down. After being honest about fighting back against the bullies, the principal is lenient and only asks Bobby to help clean the cafeteria, to the delight of the other characters. On exiting the principal's office and walking out to the hall, Bobby is tapped on the shoulder, which causes the adrenaline gland to freak out, but getting him under control, Bobby sees Annie, who thanks him for defending her. Mustering up the courage to ask her out, Buzzy helps Bobby to do so, and she replies yes, giving him a kiss and resulting in a positive ending as General Knowledge reappears and congratulates Buzzy on a job well done. Was Cranium Command a good show? I think it's certainly more interesting to watch than just listening to me describe it, and if one thing really stands out to me, it's that I really like the animation style, which has a lot of inherent charm with its unique aesthetic choices. The military motif creates some interesting characters, especially with General Knowledge, and I like the personalities of the different parts of the body, which all add comedic value. Cranium Command, while certainly a dated show that was only faintly educational, was still full of its own charm that made it another weird but endearing aspect of the wonders of life. To finish up the Pavilion, I last want to cover its major e-ticket attraction, known by the exciting name of Body Wars. When Star Tours opened in Disneyland in 1987, it was of course immensely popular, not only bringing the franchise to the park, but also introducing the first high-tech simulator attraction to a theme park with thrilling results. In the original concept for the Wonders of Life Pavilion, the anchor attraction was conceptualized as an ambitious omnimover known as the Incredible Journey Within, where, boarding a red blood cell, riders would make their way through the body as large mechanical organs, such as a beating heart, would function around them. This early concept was likely cancelled for the updated Wonders of Life because thrill rides were seen as the next necessary evolution for Epcot, which first started with Maelstrom, a thrilling boat ride for the Norway Pavilion in 1988. The following year, with the opening of the Wonders of Life, a spiritual successor to the Incredible Journey would premiere with the Star Tours simulator technology, known this time as Body Wars, and taking you through the body on a thrilling, simulated adventure. The ride experience begins with a pre-show on a television where you meet Dr. Fletcher, the chief scientist of the Miniaturization Center. He explains how white blood cells help fight bacteria and viruses, and how we now have the technology available to shrink scientists down to observe the ever-present war against disease. As an observer today, he says he'll send you down for a safe journey down to the Subskin region, which concludes the video. This is then followed by another transmission where you meet your mission control officer, and he shows you another scientific expedition that is being shrunk down to examine the bruised skin of a volunteer patient. Another video then plays where you meet Jane, your orientation officer, who essentially explains the same information, but through an animated segment to demonstrate how the shrinking technology works. Once the video concludes, park guests move forward in the hall to the station, where they then watch another video yet again. Here, you reconnect with Mission Control, and the officer introduces you to Dr. Cynthia Lair, who is inside a body and observing white blood cells as they react to a splinter penetrating the skin of the patient. The officer says that you'll be retrieving Dr. Lair on your journey, and the video then introduces you to your captain, who goes through the necessary checks for safe travel. Following his checks, a safety video for boarding the ride vehicle is played, and at its conclusion, you're finally let inside. Once the ride starts, a screen lowers, and you find yourself in the lab ready to be shrunk. This process initiates, you're shrunken down, and then you find yourself under the skin as you search for Dr. Lair. Quickly finding her, a piece of the splinter breaks off and she's pulled into a capillary, and your vehicle dives down to retrieve her. Quickly, you find yourself perilously being moved through the chambers of the heart, and the vehicle loses power, then being injected into the lungs. You encounter Dr. Lair as she's being attacked by a white blood cell, and using the surgical lasers on the vehicle to free her, she climbs on board and sits with the captain. Attempting to escape the body, you're piloted into another capillary, but losing power, the captain decides to use the heartbeat to propel you to the brain. Emerging out near the spinal cord, the vehicle indicates that it's at 2% power, and making your way to the brain, your vehicle is charged by its electrical signals. Having made it just in time, your vehicle has enough power to enlarge, and you return back to the lab for a successful mission well done, which then concludes the ride. I think that conceptually, the idea of Body Wars is more interesting than its actual execution, and while this ride does have a special appeal because its theme was unique, ultimately, Star Tours is by far the more interesting ride experience, with the Disney MGM version opening just 2 months after Body Wars. It's also notable for having lower capacity with 4 ride vehicles as opposed to Star Tours' 6, and you can really tell through how drawn out the pre-show videos are, which take up roughly 12 minutes and feel like a lot of fluff to fill in time. If you experience this more than once, I might even hazard to say that the pre-shows probably felt tedious to wade through, and the ride experience itself didn't seem very compelling either. I understand why Body Wars exists, and why it was a thrilling simulator rather than another slow-moving dark ride for Epcot, but I do find the idea of the cancelled dark ride a lot more interesting, and is something that I think would have stood the test of time a lot better. That's not to say that Body Wars wasn't interesting, but like the Wonders of Life more broadly, what made all of this intriguing is how unique and original it all was, even if I felt the execution never lived up to the classic Epcot attractions or those of the postmodern era. The Wonders of Life was a weird pavilion that really fit nowhere, whether aesthetically, through its out-of-place circus theme, or through its extremely shallow attractions around the dome. There is documentation of Imagineer Marty Sklar stating that the pavilion was a controversial challenge because theories about health were always changing. And so, with the end result, we can see that by attempting to avoid specifics and focusing more on fitness, the educational content of the pavilion turned out to be rather shallow, or in the case of Cranium Command or Body Wars, either cartoon fantasy or science fiction. The Wonders of Life is more interesting in retrospect than it ever was when operating, and when the pavilion would occasionally reopen to host events for the Food and Wine Festival, it was always interesting to walk through, knowing that there were attractions just beyond the walls that were sitting there abandoned. I think the Wonders of Life failed because it was very much flawed from the start, full of poorly conceived shows and exhibits under the dome, or because its main attractions had some noteworthy charm, but dated themselves quickly, with all of this brought together through an intriguing but incredibly ugly aesthetic that mixed a circus with Memphis design. The Wonders of Life, in many ways, was certainly Epcot's weirdest pavilion, and is a fascinating part of Disney and attraction history, but I can't say that I'm surprised to see it gone. If you made it here to the end and enjoyed what I covered in the video, you could do me a favor by leaving a like, and if you haven't hit the subscribe button with bell notification yet either, you can do so now to be alerted to new videos as they're released.